thank you very much indeed for welcoming me. And we're going to talk about two things that are really shaping the future of our profession. First of all, we've been going through the year of COVID, and don't we know it? And a lot of changes have come to the profession as a result of the experience that we've had over the last year. And also, artificial intelligence has been accelerating at pace, and that is going to radically change the shape of our profession over the years to come, to a point where we're going to have to start asking ourselves some questions about, well, what are we going to do as practitioners? Because AI is going to infuse everything that we do, and there will come a time when we're actually going to have space to be able to do those things that we've wanted to do for a long time. That is, to be far more strategic about the way that we approach our professional work. So what I'd like to do then is to talk about this pincer movement of COVID and artificial intelligence and how it's reshaping our profession. So we've been through one heck of a year, as we all know. And if we look at some of the key issues that have come from that, trust during this pandemic has been a thing of beauty to behold when it's been happening. And when the pandemic first struck in January, beginning of last year, there was a surge in trust in government and, in fact, in all institutions. And government found itself in a very privileged position of being able to talk in equitable terms to populations and to get reciprocal respect back for the work that it was trying to do to protect populations. And similarly, private sector organisations also got a surge in trust as they pivoted to do new types of work, but to support us going through the pandemic, but also to try and secure the future of their employees. But what we found over this last few months is that trust has really dived. So trust in government, in media, even in NGOs and in business has subsided to levels that are equivalent to pre-COVID days. And it's really interesting actually that during the pandemic there have been some changes in the sort of credibility sources and sources of trust that are now respected around the world. So the most credible source of for employees at the moment, and for those who are talking to friends who are employees of big organizations, is employee communication itself. And the most relied on source of information is the mainstream news. So are turning away from social media and some online platforms to go to those traditional sources of news because they're known to be researched and to work to certain standards. And the most trusted spokespeople have been doctors and scientists. And it's been really interesting, hasn't it? Well, certainly for me, and I wonder for you, to sort of compare the way that scientists and doctors have been speaking to us as compared to some politicians, and the way that scientists have directly answered questions and they've worked collaboratively across the world to try and tackle this awful pandemic that we've been facing. So another truth that's come out is that there's been a real requirement for listening and talking, frequent communications during this time of pandemic. So it's, I think, been salutary to see some of the changes that have come through COVID and professional communicators. So I'm showing you a slide here of some work done with our National Health Service here during the United Kingdom. 1.5 million people work for the National Health Service, so it's one of the largest organisations in the world, and several thousand professional communicators work within that environment. And the focus of those communicators are shown by these arrows here. So that green arrow means that factual public information has been an absolute focus of those communicators. And if you look at the two blue arrows row down on that chart there, you can see that the focus of communication in that factual provision of information has been around trying to get people to change their behavior, to keep them safe, to give them accurate information, to be a source of truth for them so that they will change their behavior to protect themselves and communities, and also to change the behavior of staff, to stop working in ways that they have traditionally worked. And we've seen the self-sacrifice of a lot of public health staff as they've worked, whatever their specialism, to look after our fellow citizens during this awful time. And it's interesting, you'll see the red arrow there, that the focus of communication has not been on reputation management. They've forgotten about that, really, because they've been so focused on factual public information and helping us change our behavior. But the interesting thing is that the reputation of the National Health Service has actually increased. So I think that's an interesting observation. Stop the obsession with reputation management and do the right thing, and your reputation increases. So the focus of public sector organizations, in contrast, has been really around reputation management, maintaining public support for reputation. And an interesting twist on this, the way that they have been judged, because reputation, remember, is in the eye of the beholder. It's sort of a society's judgment, really, on the performance of an organization is reputation. And their reputation has been calibrated against how they have treated their employees. Have they treated them well? Have they tried to keep their jobs secure? What are employees saying about their organizations? Are they advocates? Or are they saying that organizations are really seeing this, for example, as an opportunity just to make money rather than to provide a genuine service to citizens and to keep their employees safe? And issues of social justice have also become one of the things against which private sector organizations are judged. So, for example, are they really living their purpose? I don't know about you, but certainly at the beginning of this pandemic, I got all sorts of emails and tweets and stuff on Instagram, all sorts of things, asking me to stay with them. They were changing their services, and please be assured that our goods and services are going to be available to you. Absolutely right, we needed to know those things. But some work done by BlackRock, which is the largest investment organization in the world, asset management company, has said that those organizations that lived their purpose through this pandemic have actually done far better than those who focused on making money and where profit really has been their motivation. So issues of social justice around inequalities and organizations addressing inequalities, Black Lives Matter, remember, has happened during the course of the pandemic as well. And organizations being a real part of their community, helping them come through this pandemic, has been one of the criteria against which they have been judged by us, the general public. So another thing that's shifted during the pandemic is the communication mix. You probably know this PESO medal, paid, earned, shared and owned, is the communication mix currently. And during the pandemic, there's been a shift towards owned, so owned channels, and it's no coincidence that employee communication has come to the fore, and owned channels have been used as a mechanism for foregrounding employee communications, and shared media. Obviously, a lot of interaction on social media there. Earned media too, but particularly owned and shared has really begun to come to the forefront during this pandemic. And if we look to, I was mentioning internal communication and owned channels of communication. One thing that's happened is a focus on the organization becoming much more transparent. So I said that private sector organizations were being held to account by the way that they treated employees and the way that they contributed to their community. And what some organizations have done, and here's an example from Tata Steel, is to say, well, look, we need to get rid of these barriers between talking to internal audiences and talking to external audiences. We are all this together. Employee communications is so important now that actually it's going to become our principal mechanism for communicating, and will open it up to the world. So they have been using their intranet and their internal communications as a principal means of doing their external communication. And that's saying to the world, you know, how we treat our employees and what we're saying to our employees is exactly the same as we're saying to you. And then narrowing this gap, sometimes we call this the legitimacy gap between what is being said and done internally and what is being said and done externally. And this idea of transparency and removing the barriers has really come to the fore during COVID. And I mentioned this move towards purpose and the fact that organizations have been held to account on how they actually treat the wider community. And here's the website of Unilever. They do products like Dove. You're probably very familiar with Unilever's products. And what they did early on in the pandemic was not only say we're going to make sure that all our products are available, but this is really interesting. Can you see on this slide here, it says that they are going to include contributing $100 million worth of donations of soap, sanitizer, bleach and food, and making available $500 million to their small suppliers so that they remain viable as businesses. And Unilever is one of the organizations that's come out of this pandemic really well, because it said, look, we have to live our purpose. This is the first and biggest test of whether or not the turn to purpose, if you like, is genuine or if we're just purpose washing. And this move towards environmental, social and governance is being driven not just within organizations, but the investor community is requiring this as well. So I'm going to show you a letter here from a guy called, oh, that's not translated all that well, Deb, I'm afraid. This guy, Larry Fink, is the chief executive of an organization called BlackRock. And BlackRock is the largest investment management company in the world. So they invest in companies. And this is a statement from their chief executives in an open letter to all executives. And I think it's a brilliant statement for us. It's clear that being connected to stakeholders, establishing trust, acting with purpose, enables a company to understand and respond to the challenges of the world. Companies ignore stakeholders at their peril. And companies who do not earn this trust will find it harder and harder to attract customers and talent, especially young people. And increasingly, they will find that their place in the world is denied to them by organizations like BlackRock and people like us, ordinary citizens, holding them to account. And what's brilliant about this is that talk about connection to stakeholders, because that puts us as communicators who are responsible for stakeholder communication right at the heart of organizations, clearly important, driving things like purpose, driving things like strategy within the organization, because strategy and purpose has to be informed and supported by stakeholders. So this is marvelous news for us. And interesting, Larry Fink is saying now that to be invested in by BlackRock, you need to demonstrate that you're going to be a carbon zero company by 2020. He says they want to see those statements, those sustainability statements, and they also want to see a talent management and a talent statement attached to those sustainability statements. And this is all about ensuring that young people have a future. So this is transformational for us, and also it's transformational of organizations as they face the future following COVID. So McKinsey is probably known to you, one of the largest consultancies, management consultancies in the world, and they are reimagining the post-pandemic organization. And I think this is absolutely fantastic news for us. So what they talk about is three questions that organizations have to ask themselves: who we are, how we operate, and how we grow. And who we are is all collected around a sense of purpose and the value that you add to society and to communities and to citizens, and all about the sort of culture that you are cultivating as an organization, which is about collaboration and cooperation and about contribution beyond the boundaries of the organization. And who's going to be involved in that? Well, we are as communicators, because that purpose has to be tested. Our stakeholders are going to support it. The value that you contribute to society has got to be measured by us engaging with stakeholders and judging how the contribution of companies is being measured by wider citizen communities and by investment communities, and of course. And at the heart of culture, organizational culture, is of course communication, and how you build cultures of collaboration which sustain companies into the future. So the question about how we operate just amplifies that, really, and it says, you know, we can no longer function as command and control organizations. We have to remember that we're part of an ecosystem that involves our employees, that involves communities and other stakeholders. And we have to show that we are contributing to that ecosystem. We have to be a learning organization, and learning involves us listening. If we don't listen, we won't learn. And who's going to help organizations listen? Professional communicators. And of course, it's about platforms. So it's about the nature of the business, moving to platform businesses away from traditional businesses. That means AI-driven businesses, digital businesses, and I'll come back to that shortly. And it also means about how the company operates, which is around developing talent, building structures that are healthy, that mean that you can draw teams together from across the organization. We're not siloed anymore, where decision making is devolved to people who are connected to other people, where teams have a level of autonomy, and you grow by learning and listening, and by making sure that the talent that you have is encouraged. I think this is fantastic news for us. And also changes of thinking about the public sector, reimagining public sector communication. A lot of thinking done around the ethics of public sector communication, which has been quite paternalistic in many ways. But often it's governments have become quite tell the people, and you hear words like, particularly with behavior change on the horizon and becoming more embedded in communication, will drive citizen behavior. Well, actually, we need to stop and just reflect on that. And these three things in the middle of the circle here about transparency and participation and collaboration are actually driven by thinking from the OECD. So that's an international NGO that's concerned with development. They're saying that to be ethical, you need to be transparent and collaborative and participatory in your decision making. And if you're going to generate trust as opposed to people distrusting you, those principles need to be enacted by you as governments and in the public sector more and more. And instead of, say, taking decisions behind closed doors, as this vertical access shows, and certainly that's been my experience in the UK, where decision making seems to have been taken by elite experts locked away in the cabinet office somewhere, rather than being open and collaborative and drawing on the wisdom of citizens and on local organisations like local hospitals and local authorities with all their wealth of knowledge. Then to gain trust, you've got to begin to devolve power and decision making and be open and transparent in decision making. And again, this is fantastic for us because that puts communication front and center of everything about public life. I just want to move on now quickly, and I'm not going to spend too much time on this because we could do a whole lecture around this, about the impact of artificial intelligence. We know that there's going to be a lot of changes because of artificial intelligence right throughout society, lots of social impacts. It's changing the structure of society. We know that there are now new elites, the big digital companies, Google, Amazon, etc., have got more power than governments. Don't I know it? What about the argument with Facebook and the Australian government over funding local journalism? You know, these are big organizations that have a lot of power. And we know that there's human engagement is changing. Face-to-face communication and online communication is swapping places in terms of priority. And we know that there are huge opportunities for governments and organizations to implement a surveillance culture within our countries and across the globe, and we've seen evidence of this. We know that the workforce will have to transit into working into digital economies, and this is where you've got huge advantage, you're digital natives. A lot of people will be replaced, and there'll be large numbers of people who are not able to make that adjustment. And there'll be a lot of money needed to be invested in reskilling the way that employees operate. Some jobs will be completely supplemented by AI, and some of those very expensive professionals, like for example lawyers and the diagnosis in the medical profession, will be done faster and cheaper and more accurately by AI. So the challenges to professional boundaries are there. And there are big questions about the governance of AI. You know, and we're marching towards a dystopia if we're not careful, if people don't come first, and unless ethics are embedded in decision making within organizations in governance because of the power that AI gives them. Big data tells them everything that they want to know. You know, Facebook knows more about you than your parents know about you, than your closest friend know about you. Transactions with government now are normally done online, and they are learning so much about us in order to be able to nudge our behavior. You know, living in democracies, nudging our behavior to do good things. But equally, if you don't live in a democracy or these things are not controlled, it could be towards controlling you rather than enabling you to become liberated as a citizen. So there's a whole lecture to be had on AI and ethics. If you're interested in this, the world's first AI guide to artificial intelligence in public relations is published by the Chartered Institute of Public Relations here in the UK, and you can get access to that. And I've listed there on the left some of the ethical challenges. You know, life online and all the traces that we leave online means that people are harvesting this and understanding us to an extent that would scare us if we knew. Lots of power being given to organizations who have the resources to collect and aggregate and analyze and make decisions based on big data. Algorithms are able to predict what we're going to do and in fact direct us by narrowing our choices into doing things that maybe we wouldn't have done if we were in full possession of the facts. Lots of issues about transparency and privacy, choice and agency, far too many to discuss here. But we're moving into a world where artificial intelligence requires governance. And if we look at the world of public relations, this is some work again that the Chartered Institute of Public Relations did in the UK, looking at the world of work in public relations on the left there in 2018, where you can see about a quarter of our work was AI infused. But now, the prediction for 2023, although it's now, because COVID has accelerated this, shows that AI is infused 2/3 of our work. So what's left for us to do is the question, because AI is doing everything in the world on public relations, right from doing the research for us, choosing what audiences we should engage with, telling us all about the behaviors and preferences of those audiences, determining which channels are most effective to contact them, designing the content for him, delivering the content via chatbots or virtual reality or whatever, evaluating the work that we do. So what is left for us to do? Big question. Well, a number of things. And I think that this is where we can step back and actually rejoice that AI is going to do a lot of the sort of drudge work for us, because it's going to liberate us to do some key things. It's going to enable us to be more strategic. It's going to help us demonstrate our leadership capabilities, because we understand context. And by that I mean, at the moment, AI can only deal with the data that it's given. But we understand the context in which society operates. We know what the trends are. We know how people are going to react to certain decisions because we're connected with them. Purpose. We know that organizations need to get their purpose supported by stakeholders. And who's going to test whether that purpose is supportable? It's going to be us. Who's going to have those conversations that shapes that purpose? It's going to be us. I mentioned as developing strategy, because that means about setting the direction of organizations, not just based on data, but what's right and what's acceptable to people, what gives meaning to them, what sort of future do we want to have. Those are all things that human beings at the moment need to determine. And those issues around empathy, about building relationships and connectedness and building collaboration, understanding the importance of human emotion and human connection, those are the things that are best done by human beings at the moment, although AI might just catch us up. And then there's something to do about conscience and about ethics and governance and about integrity. AI will drive us to decisions that are entirely logical. Just because they're logical and based on fact doesn't mean that they're right. Just because we can do something doesn't mean that we should do something. Things like discretion, doing things that build trust, doing things that build a sense of reciprocity and contribution takes more than artificial intelligence. So just beginning to wrap up then, I think there are some lessons for us as communicators, and I'll frame it really around those three things on the right-hand side there, around competence, integrity, and compassion. When the outside is looking in, what they're looking for are organizations that are competent. And by that, I don't mean just providing goods and services. I mean that they are competent for being supported in the world. So they are contributing. They are competent socially. They're competent towards their employees. They're competent because they're doing the right thing. And then Inside relationships, that means dealing with integrity with employees. The inside now is the story that's being told outside. Employees are telling that story, and how employees and employers are interacting together is the story of whether or not there is integrity within the organization. And then us as professional communicators and organizations looking from the inside out, this is about showing empathy and compassion. This is about relationships and building linkages with people that give them meaning. And I use that mnemonic there's CIC, because this is based on the Greek words for communication. So competence is really about logos. This is about us being rational organizations in a world that have a reason to be supported. Integrity is, compassion is about ethos. That's about building connection. And integrity is about pathos. The other way around, sorry, it's getting late for me. Compassion is about pathos, which is about love and emotions, and integrity is about ethos, which is about ethics. So there's nothing new in the world. The Greeks had it right all the time. AI is driving us in this direction. COVID has shown us that this is the right way to behave in the world if we're going to gain trust as organizations and gain support. So that's what I wanted to say about the COVID world, the AI-infused world, and what this means for us as communication professionals. I think COVID and AI brings us into a place as a profession where we're absolutely central to the very DNA of our organizations. Communication is what makes organizations, and it's what connects us to the external world. Communication is what makes us human. And the one thing that has come out of the COVID pandemic, and you have a neighbor called Jacinda Ardern, and you have some politicians in your country have been doing a great job in demonstrating that communication with integrity, with compassion, and with competence is the thing that is going to get us through COVID, is going to get us through to a good place with AI, and is going to position our profession as the most essential within organizations. Thank you very much. So I'm open to any